I'm delighted to welcome Lord Daniel Finkelstein, OBE, who is a renowned British journalist, politician and author. He is a former executive editor of The Times and remains a weekly political columnist for the paper every Wednesday. He's also a regular columnist in the Jewish Chronicle. He has been political columnist of the year 4 times and a member of the House of Lords since 2013. But he's not perfect. He's a director of Chelsea Football Club. And for anyone interested in politics or the study of politics, participates in an excellent weekly podcast with Matt Chorley, Peter Mandelson and Polly Mackenzie entitled How to Win Elections, although he has modestly and wrongly said it should be called How to Lose Elections. He has advised every Conservative leader since John Major, except for Boris Johnson, Ian Duncan Smith and Liz Truss, which tells you everything you need to know. He has authored 2 books, Everything in Moderation, and in June 2023 published this acclaimed memoir, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, an account of his mother and father's experiences during World War II. Lord Finkelstein's late mother, Miriam Finkelstein, née Wiener, was a Holocaust survivor of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camps, while his late father, Ludwig Finkelstein, OBE, was born in Lvov, then in Poland and now Ukraine, and after the war became a professor of measurement and instrumentation and pro-vice chancellor of the City University in London. Lord Finkelstein is the grandson of Dr. Alfred Wiener, the renowned campaigner against Nazism and founder of the Wiener Holocaust Library. I hope I haven't missed anything out.
No. I don't know why anyone needs to bother reading it now.
That's just you, not the book. In your writings, you very often quote your late grandmother who said, "While the Queen is safe in Buckingham Palace, we are safe in Hendon Central." Other than the fact there's now a king, do you still think, especially after the events of October the 7th and the reactions and protests here, that your grandmother's assertion is true for us?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say how nice it is to be here. I was just talking, but I've met various people with whom I grew up in Hendon, because I lived in Cheney Walk, and some of the start of this book is set in Hendon Central, referencing Batty's and Hanson's and the various places that some of you who lived in here for a long time will still recall. And it's a great pleasure to come back here, and also quite a large number of people. I did once go to Norwich to give a speech, and I went all the way there. When I arrived there, it took 4 hours. There was only 2 people, and one of them was the person that had invited me. It's really and so then I had to kind of make embarrassed conversation with the other guy, because he'd come, about why I was there, and asked him. And at the end, I said, "Would you like to join the cause I was there to promote?" And he said, "I would, but it would interfere with the terms of my parole." So better audience. So it's an interesting question. I partly wrote this book because while I do not believe the things that happened to my parents will happen to me or to my children, I can no longer answer it with the same confidence that 10 years ago I answered it at my 50th birthday. Would I make the same speech now? With the same kind of confidence? I wouldn't. But do I essentially believe that Jews are safe in this country? Yes. I'm still very optimistic about this country. My wife just very occasionally points out that, Alfred, my grandfather, was a very committed German Jew and felt great loyalty to that country, and felt that these 2 phrases, German and Jew, belonged together, and it was a disaster. But to that I reply, in 1918, my grandfather came back from the First World War, and he already understood the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, and he published a tract called Towards Pogroms, ? And he finishes it with the phrase, if we don't do anything about what I've written about, we will be talking to our descendants of Bastille murder. So he saw what was happening, and when you read that, you appreciate two things. The first is that lots of things that Alfred wrote about, the rise of conspiracy theory, the financing of militant extremism, the contempt for the democratic political system, the thought that Jews might be at the heart of it, the importance of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and theories relating to it. You can see all those things in British public life, but when you read that pamphlet, you realise that already in 1919, it was much worse in Germany than it is here at this point. So I retain a degree of optimism, but it's more guarded than it was 10 years ago.
Thank you. No, I mean, I felt confident asking the questions for two reasons. One, I think my own, or probably everybody's Jewish neuroses. But when I asked you the question at the height of Corbynism in 2018, your first reply was, when I agreed, it was a public thing, so I'm not repeating any private conversations, when I agreed to my peerage, my wife said, when the time comes for us to get out, we won't. So your wife has got the same...
That's what she worried about it, yeah.
But also felt confident because Alfred Wiener was really a visionary, because he saw what no one else saw, as you sort of set out, and campaigned doggedly, almost like, Noah saying to everybody there's going to be a flood for 120 years. It wasn't that long, but... Yeah, the big argument that Alfred had, well, the first argument was in 1919, seeing this potential rise in anti-Semitism when others didn't see it, and the book actually begins after I've talked about my parents and living in Hendon, but the Alfred story begins with him confronting the head of a coup that took place in Berlin in 1920 called the Cat Putsch, because he was worried about the anti-Semitism of the Freikorps, and so he was very brave. And then in the mid-1920s, he began to see something else that other people didn't see, which was that the Jewish, the anti-Semitic movements were congealing around the Nazis and Hitler, and that is why he began then to collect everything that all the papers and documents and newspapers and every issue of Die Stürmer. And he created this archive. It had to be a secret in order that the truth could be established. And ultimately, years later, just to give it one small example, after the war, it was said that Mengele was in Argentina. But the problem was nobody knew what Mengele looked like. So it was impossible people obviously knew him face to face, but people who hadn't actually encountered him face to face didn't know that. And Alfred was the one person in the world who kept a photograph of Mengele. Now, he was also remarkable because he was a proud German patriot, but anti-Nazi, but he was also an avowed anti-Zionist in those years.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, this. So, obviously now, like me, almost everybody in this room would describe themselves as a Zionist and is pro-Israel. But at the time that this debate was taking place in the 1920s, Alfred's view was quite mainstream. So he was a very committed Jewish scholar, nearly became a rabbi, and he was particularly interested in Palestine. He was actually an Arabic as well as a Hebrew and a Jewish scholar. So he had kept, he went back and forth to Palestine, and he eventually writes a book called A Critical Journey Through Palestine. And his view was, look, it's a Jewish homeland, but I don't think it should be a state, because we already have a state. We live in Germany, we live in Poland. We can't all go to Israel to create a state of Israel and Palestine. There isn't enough room for everybody. And he also thought the kibbutz were utopian projects, into which, as he said, nobody's ever made a project like that succeed anywhere, and enough community money has gone into making that work. He was a little bit more agnostic about whether Tel Aviv would work, in other words, whether sort of more vigorous capitalist areas of Israel would work. But he opposed that idea of a state. Well, he was essentially saying, look, there are lots of people there, they'll never leave us in peace, so we can't have peace there, to which the Zionists responded, well, if you stay here, you won't have peace. And the great tragedy of the Jewish people, and the reason why I've become pretty combative against opponents of Israel, is that they were both right. Okay, so the people who Alfred was right about it being very difficult to get peace in the land of Israel, and the Zionists were right to tell them, if we stay here, we're all going to die. And so at some point in history, we have to sort of say, well, you know, people often say some of our worst opponents, one of their most horrible jibes is, you know, the Jews haven't learnt the lesson of the Holocaust. And I wrote an article on this saying, I didn't realise it was supposed to teach us a lesson. What, you know, I must tell my mum. This lesson apparently was that we should be nice to people, which was a lesson we already knew, thank you, without having to be taught it by the Nazis of all people. So it's a grotesque thing to say. But it never seems to occur to the people who say it that the lesson of the Holocaust was, let's not let that happen again, and if you try to do it again next time, you'll find we've got a gun, right? And the fact that that is such an obvious lesson of the Holocaust doesn't seem to have struck me, but it certainly struck Alfred. After the war, Alfred was a supporter of Israel, and you know, at my home we had you know, the classic J&F box on the landing for any money that we found in the street or small change that we had or whatever it was. I often use the story, the fact that my grandfather had this mainstream view. He wrote a book that had to be reprinted because so many Germans bought it, and his was the mainstream view of German Jews. It's a view that was perfectly tenable at the time, is no longer tenable. And I think it's one of our strongest arguments for those people who say this project wasn't necessary, because it certainly was.
So Alfred saw the writing on the wall in Germany and moved his family out of Germany to Amsterdam, which now people who are not that well versed in Holocaust history go, why Amsterdam? And most people who are versed would know that it was deemed to be safe as houses. It was nuclear. It was neutral during the First World War. So when he moved his family and thought they were safe.
The first thing is that he was in Germany. It wasn't simply that he spotted that he had to move. When the Nazis came, he was called to a meeting with Goering. This meeting at first seemed to go fine, and then pretty much as they were leaving, Goering said, I know you have the archive and you have to destroy it. By that point, Alfred had used the archive to sue quite a number of prominent Nazis, cost the Nazi party a lot of money. Julius Streicher had ended up in jail, actually, because of things that he'd published in Die Stürmer that Alfred had arranged for his organisation to sue him for. So Alfred realised he was in personal danger. He'd actually given, in a meeting at the Reichschancellery, he'd given this document they had created of cemetery desecration to the Chancellor, von Papen's advisor, to which von Papen's advisor had replied, don't worry about Hitler, he's a decent and idealistic person, if a bit overexcitable. That's what he actually said. Alfred wrote it down, so I know exactly what he said. So he realises he has to get out of Germany, but he chooses Holland. At that time, that was a perfectly reasonable choice, but the big decision was that when it comes to later, when he has to leave Holland, because Holland is neutral and is worried that his collecting work, after Kristallnacht, they realise what Alfred is doing, that he's been in Switzerland suing the head of the publishers of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He's got all these documents which he's using he's got these eyewitness statements on Kristallnacht. The Dutch worry about it, and the Dutch Prime Minister calls in the chairman of my grandfather's office and says, you have to stop doing this. So he goes to London, but he doesn't take the family with. And this is important because, obviously they then get caught in Holland when Holland's invaded. What's important is that you often, when you talk to people say, my relatives were prescient and they got out. In order to be prescient, get out and survive, you had to go to the right place, and that was very difficult to know what that was. And to believe that Britain was safer than Holland was actually eccentric, really. And the woman for whom my grandmother worked is recorded having said to Chaim Weizmann, right just after, she'd just been to London to see my grandfather, then she sees Weizmann, I think, in Switzerland, and says, we think Holland will remain neutral. And my grandmother stays in Holland with the children. And then, while my grandfather is in London, at the very last minute, they realise this is a mistake. And then they try and get out, but by then by the time they get the visas necessary, it's too late.
Was he haunted by that in later life? Or did he think I made the right decision at that time?
It's interesting. I don't know the answer to that question. So I only have two little clues. The first is that my grandmother, Greta, told my mother and the girls that the reason they hadn't left was because her sister was in Holland and they didn't want to break the family up, which is plausible, but I discovered from correspondence that she shared with Alfred isn't true. They stayed for the children, so clearly Greta didn't want to place that burden on my mother and her sisters. So clearly in that way they did recognise it was a mistake. The only other thing I've got is that my uncle Ted, he's the one person in this generation that lived until he was 97 and died while I was researching the book and I spoke to him. And my uncle Ted said to me, he'd always been quite critical of Alfred for not taking the girls to London and for one or two other decisions that he makes as well. And I said, what did Eva and my mother say when you said that to them? She said they were furious with me and I had to shut up. So the family view was, it was one of those things. My mother always had a very strong view, which was the Nazis were to blame. There's an episode later in the book where one of my grandfather's colleagues makes an obvious mistake, and the result of it down the line is he dies and various other people from whom he withheld certain papers die as well. Was that his fault? My mother's was clear, no, it was Hitler's fault. And I think this is one of the reasons why she never felt a bitterness later. She felt it was the Nazis' fault and we beat the Nazis.
I will come on to your grandmother, but just one more last question on your grandfather. Was he proud that the indictment for the Nuremberg trial used his archive?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, he was two things. I'm sure he was proud of it, but there was another thing. After the war, extraordinarily, nobody really sees the point of keeping together all these documents about Nazis. And my grandfather had really 20 years, he dies in 1964, for 20 years he just had to scramble for money. So I'm sure that the thing he saw most of all was it would be good for fundraising. And I say that because the man who saves the library, interestingly enough, my grandfather had quite a good eye for who could give him money, who would be political support. And a Labour MP, he spots a Labour MP in the newspaper who has talked about Nazi war trials and having been very affected by them. So he involves this Labour MP in the library, who then becomes a minister and has to leave. But years later, returns and is now Jim Callaghan. At that point, he wasn't even Jim Callaghan, he was Leonard Callaghan. Jim Callaghan changed his name later. And he comes and holds big events, and the money for that saves the library even after my grandfather's death. But essentially, yes, he was proud, but when they helped the Eichmann trial, they're invited to both the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann trials because of the help they give. They're given the Nuremberg and the Eichmann papers, but they were invited to the Eichmann trial. They couldn't accept the invitation because they didn't have enough money.
Wow. And really, I will move on to your grandmother, Greta. Sure. But the one thing that probably my own personal fascination. Your grandfather was a proud German. When he died, he wanted his funeral service conducted in Hebrew and German. He had the Kranz, the wreath of the President of the Federal Republic of Germany. Was he ever tempted to go back to Germany, or?
I don't think that was ever an option. So he became British after the war because his service, he'd come to Britain with the library, helped the government with things like who was Rudolf Hess, Hess lands. The government thinks he's a moderate because he's come to negotiate. Alfred can show he's actually an extremist crank, and in fact had a screw loose, and that was very important information. So he's become a British citizen, and I don't think he ever contemplated living again in Germany. He dies when he's 18, he doesn't go back. But he does do two things. One is he spends a lot of time after the war talking to young people in Germany, always coming back full of optimism about it. He found it a wonderful experience. And partly as a result of his work during and before the war, partly as a result of that, he gets the highest German medal, which is the Federal Grand Cross. And some people think you shouldn't accept that from the Germans, but he was clear that he should accept it, partly because he'd been recommended personally by Adenauer and he admired Adenauer. So I think he didn't. The library was here and it wasn't going to be in Germany, so he was where the library was. But he clearly remained a German, or even after everything that had happened.
Fascinating. Your grandmother, Greta, was also a remarkable figure. She had a PhD in economics in the 1920s, which was pretty much a rarity in free market economics.
It's an amazing, this is one of the most amazing bits of the research in the book. So one of the problems I've got is I don't speak German and I don't speak Polish. My parents, interestingly enough, they never really made much of an effort to get us to learn languages, even though my father had 9 languages and he found it very professionally useful. But I think it was because they really just wanted us to be British and they didn't want us to have these other languages. So it was difficult to translate these things. And to give you an example, Alfred had 26 pieces of correspondence with Otto Frank. They knew the Frank family reasonably well, and they were all in German, and I could put them now into Google Translate. You can scan them, put the text into Google Translate, do a few corrections, you can get a pretty good translation. It's not good enough for use in the book, but it's good enough to identify whether or not this is an interesting letter. So that's how I did an awful lot of the translating until I came to Greta's PhD, and it's 300 pages. So what am I going to do about that? In the end, I had to settle for a kind of account that's somebody had given me about what the headline of it meant, and I put half a line. It wasn't worth paying someone to translate 300 pages in order to get 2 lines. But at a party, I bored somebody about the book that was coming, and I mentioned Greta's PhD, and she was an economist and German, and really, really interested in the Holocaust. So she went and got this document, and I found out what was in it. And it turns out my grandmother's preoccupation was with the fact that theoretical libertarian politicians in Germany before the war weren't real free market economists. In other words, her politics and her interests are so close to mine, political interests are so close to mine, as to be truly uncanny. And I was completely shocked by it, because it's not, I mean, it's a nuance even in academic literature, and a nuance in politics, and we're both in the same nuance without knowing it. Well, maybe it's a coincidence, but maybe it isn't.
But the Nazis invade Holland, your grandfather's in London, your grandmother and your mother and her 2 sisters are in Amsterdam, in Holland, and suddenly she's in sole charge of feeding the girls and feeding herself. Yeah,
she has no money. I mean, this is one of the things that's very interesting about the book, actually in both the stories in the book, is just how much of a sort of administrative strain all this was on everyone. The overhead on their life. Just the whole thing of where do you buy food, how do you earn any money? My grandfather was earning the money, my grandmother had lived at home, she'd done a lot of voluntary work for refugees. So she goes to work essentially as a secretary in the refugee department of the Jewish Council. It's just very interesting to see how big in the correspondence the money worries loom during the whole of the war period. And I mean, they were never that well off either of my grandparents, because my grandfather didn't earn much and spent what he did earn on books.
But they had citizenship of that well-known country, Panama.
Paraguay.
Paraguay.
I'll tell you how that came out. So actually this, so what happens after the Nazis arrive is that they, in fact in the letter that's sent on the day that war is declared, Greta notes that they've had their citizenship withdrawn, German citizenship withdrawn. So they're now stateless. And they then spend the next 2 to 3 years searching desperately for some papers and failing a lot of the time. Alfred goes to New York, he's working with the State Department. Can they portray him as American? They obviously can't. They are involved in a scam where they get cheated out of money to buy Cuban visas. Nothing seems to work. They do get a certificate, which is in fact a moderately of use, where they're put on a list, a sort of queue to go to Palestine, but actually there's never any chance they will do, but being on that list I think was pretty helpful to them. But there is, at the last minute, another visa scam, a sort of forgery. The Polish embassy in Bern, run by the Polish government in exile, gets hold of the fact that you can get this Swiss notary called Rudolf Hugli. You could pay him some money, and he is the Paraguayan honorary consul, and he can sign Paraguayan passports. So he begins to first sell the ones that he's got, then he starts to print them, and people buy them from him. And this became a source that saved hundreds, possibly thousands of lives. And one of these documents, I'm annoyed now that I haven't got it all with me, but it's at home. But one of these documents comes into my parents' hands for reasons that I won't spoil for readers of the book. It's an amazing coincidence that in itself, how they get hold of this document. But they become citizens of Paraguay, and for reasons that we'll go into, this was a life-saving document. It saved their life on more than one occasion.
Okay, I'm not going to go into the Paraguayan the way they got that. I won't do the spoiler, but just to keep on with your grandmother Greta, when I think you detailed in the book every Tuesday there was.
Yeah. So what happens with Dutch Jews? First of all, they're arresting more and more and more Dutch Jews, and they can basically put it off because Greta was working for the Jewish Council, but towards the summer of 1943, they're really arresting everybody. And in 20th of June 1943 comes the time for the Wiener girls. And they get arrested, they go to, there's an amazing story in the book also about the home help Betty and what happens to her, which I also won't spoil, but which is a chapter of its own, but which is quite extraordinary. But my grandma's arrested, they're sent to Westerbork, which is essentially a sort of transit camp. It's a concentration camp in the sense they're concentrating the Jewish population in order to eliminate them, but it's not an extermination camp. So there's a lot of debate about whether Westerbork should be called a concentration camp, but actually the correspondence that went to my grandmother there calls it concentrations lager, so I think it's reasonable to call it that. In Westerbork, every Tuesday there were transports, and these transports went to the gas chambers. They were evacuated to the east, but that's what that meant. They went either to Auschwitz, where some people do survive, because as you know, there's a rampway and the people are divided and some people work. Of those people who work, some of those people, a small number of those people survive. We know those Auschwitz survivors. But for several months, people were sent somewhere else, to Sobibor. In Sobibor, the time that you lived was 3 hours and nobody was sent to work. And essentially nobody survives. In fact, we only really know anything about Sobibor because right at the end of that, there's a breakout. And so there were a few people who did then come and say what happened. But the Nazis kept no papers. Very few people know, the hundreds of thousands of people that were killed in Sobibor, and among them my great aunt. My mother and her sisters and my grandmother don't go on these Tuesday transports because they have the exemption that they are citizens of Paraguay. The Himmler has created an exchange idea. He's going to exchange Jews for money, for tanks, for Germans living in occupied Allied countries. If anybody had any eligibility to be exchanged with the Allies, Himmler decided he was going to keep them, and he created a special camp for keeping them, which was Belsen. So in January 1941, my mother and her sisters and my grandmother are sent to Belsen. And as you know, what really happens is that almost nobody is exchanged. Himmler's deluded about this plan. And ultimately they use Belsen as a place where everybody comes as the other camps, because it's in the middle of the country near Hanover, as every other place collapses, they all come towards Belsen, and including Anne Frank. And my aunt kept a little diary, and in it says, she's just seen Margot and Anne Frank, which is like an extraordinary thing to see in the next door sort of area of the camp. And so my mother goes to Belsen and stays there almost until the end, when everyone is beginning to starve to death because they haven't been exchanged. And just at that point, you can ask me another question.
I think at that point there is a story of survival, and you can read it in here.
Shall I tell it? No, I'll tell it. I was giving you a chance. I took.
I wasn't quite sure what you wanted me to do. Didn't want to say the spoiler.
I won't tell you everything that happens, but basically, finally, the Allies do agree to a small exchange, and this involves mainly Americans whom they've interned and they're returning to the United States. But it also involves 136, I apologise, Jews who were in Belsen, whom they, for arcane reasons, the Allies have hold of many hundreds of South Americans, Germans, who've been living in South America. So they agreed to return those in exchange for 136 people from Belsen with Latin American passports or Central American passports, and my mother is one of those. And so just as the camp is collapsing, just as everybody is dying, as everyone is, including the whole family, including my grandmother particularly, is extremely sick, they are put on a train and they are sent to Switzerland. And one last thing which gives you a brilliant, I think it's, my view, is the single detail of it that I found the most extraordinary. When they were sent to Westerbork, Greta has to give them what little money she has. She has a few £100, £300, something like that, in that region. She has to hand it in, and it goes into some bank. And there is in Westerbork even a shop. Not that there's actually anything in the shop, but I think on one occasion it was possible to buy a toothbrush. As they're getting on this train, they are stopped and told one last thing: we need to give you your money back. And they say, well, you bought a toothbrush, and also they've various train tickets of other people whom they've sent to the gas chambers were charged to the account of the Jews, and then they get the change. And I think if anything explains the mentality, extraordinary mentality of these appalling people and their sort of world view in which they've got themselves sort of enmeshed in this immorality of a grotesque kind, then I think this story does.
I don't want to do a spoiler, but I think to pay tribute to your grandmother, it was a very, very rare feat that she literally starved herself to death so
Absolutely.
her girls would eat, and then literally willed herself to live until...
Look, she did really. She gave the girls, Ruth and my mother's older sister and Eva and Miriam realised this only when they had children of their own. They realised their mother had starved herself to feed them. One of the things that I found when I was doing this research, I had boxes of papers in a really sort of higgledy-piggledy. So just to give you an idea, I once opened a Pan Am ticket folder, and inside it was a little brown piece of paper, which when I translated it was sending my grandmother and my mother and her sisters to Belsen. And it was like sort of stuck in anyway. The next piece of paper in the same box, it was faint writing, but I realised it was Greta's handwriting because I had some other examples of it. And the first word, I couldn't really read it, and I couldn't scan it or do anything because it was handwritten. And the first word in it was omelette. So I was like, what is this document? So I gave it to the Wiener Library, and they came back translating. What it was that Belsen, people who lived in Belsen thought about food all the time, and they talked about food. In fact, in the literature, it's everywhere, this particular fact. Once you know about it, I spotted it everywhere. And clearly Greta had written down her family recipes just to be thinking about food. I mean, they're recipes literally for things like omelette. But the most poignant for me was, the translator said the only thing that was a bit odd was that she made risotto, which was, that's anachronistic, right? The idea of making risotto at that time. But when I read the risotto, when I read it, and when she read it, she realised this risotto recipe was in fact fried rice. And so therefore Greta didn't know how to make risotto, she just knew the word. And the reason that was poignant is my mum used to make something that she called risotto, and it was fried rice actually. And the reason I know that is once I ordered risotto in a restaurant, I loved my mother's fried rice, and I got this horrible mushy thing.
Okay, so this the story of your mother and your grandparents is a well-trodden odyssey. Your father's story and what he endured is not, on a with a macro level, is not well known.
Absolutely. It's I would say this that my mother's is an extraordinary version of a story that we do know, the Holocaust story, but it's because of the Paraguayan passports, because of my grandfather, because of the people they knew. It's an extraordinary version of our story. My father's version is actually a completely bog standard, banal version of a story that people just don't know anything about.
So your father and your grandfather and his brother were mega successful businessmen in Lvov.
Yes.
They were the kings of metal. I think you reflected, I don't know, but you or your father said that at some point they reflected that the tracks that took them...
Oh yeah, I must have told you that personally rather than that's not in the book, because afterwards, do you know, every time you write an article or anything like this, you always think, oh, that's so annoying. That was a really good point, and I forgot to put it in. That was it. But I obviously told you that, Anna, when we were having tea. So yeah, I do think that's true. That my grandfather was called the Iron King. That was his nickname, and I think that probably on the train that took him ultimately to the Gulag, he probably ran on Finkelstein and Fehler steel.
So the Soviets and the Nazis did the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, and Lvov is Soviet, and they come in, and I think what's the phrase that you've used? You said that the Soviets arrested every shopkeeper, irrespective of whether they were Jewish.
No, I think the way it was is that the Soviets arrested all the shopkeepers, some of whom were Jewish, and the Nazis arrested all the Jews, some of whom were shopkeepers. And essentially they both had this idea that bourgeois liberal democracy and capitalism was a bad idea, that they were both anti-pluralist, and they felt that there was a gigantic conspiracy that was undermining the will of the people. In the Soviets' case, it was Polish nationalism, Judaism and capitalism, and in the Nazis' case it was just the Jews. Right? But they both were conspiracy theories, and in fact the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in many ways, though they loosed off rhetoric against each other, was actually just a meeting of minds. And it was very important. Once the Nazis invaded Poland, where my grandfather lived, in Lvov, so he lived in a place that is now in Ukraine, but they invaded Poland. Eastern Poland had been allocated by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to belong to be the Soviet zone. Interestingly, my dad used to say to me that the elders of the city had decided to surrender to the Soviets rather than the Nazis because there were so many Jews in the city. But actually, that's not. It's interesting that he thought that even very late on. It's actually not true. They surrendered. It was surrendered to the Soviets because it had been agreed between Hitler and Stalin that it would be. And they were so successful at disguising what they'd done that even, my dad didn't die until 2011, that even in this century, people who were directly impacted by it didn't realise what the two of them had done.
So your grandfather gets called away.
Yeah. So my grandfather is arrested. So they arrested everybody. If you had the slightest national standing of any local standing of any kind, certainly, I'm really sorry to break to the president of a synagogue, you've had it. Anybody who's got a shop and successful, the head teacher. But even if you were a philatelist, which meant that you had international contacts, you tried to speak Esperanto, everyone got arrested. When my grandfather was, the Iron King, he was a local councillor, he was a big donor to the synagogue, so he was obviously quite early on arrested. And he is sent to the Gulag. He's sentenced to 8 years as an antisocial element. And that's a phrase, by the way, that you can still see employed in various Soviet and then even post-Soviet contexts. My grandmother wonders where he's gone because he's been asked to sign some documents, but they've actually arrested him. So she goes to find him and don't worry about it, we're just questioning him, come back in 4 days' time, and everything will be arranged, you can reunite with him, and in 3 days' time they arrest all of the families. So he has been sent to the Gulag, in a long process that ultimately ends up with him being in part of Siberia. My grandmother and my father, who's 10 years old, is their only son, they're arrested and sent to are they arrested? They're apprehended because they're not charged with any crime. They can no longer live anywhere else other than a state collective farm in the northern Kazakhstan on the borders with Siberia. And that is where my grandmother finds herself. There's nowhere for them to live because when they get there, there's 90 Poles, there's about 120 Kazakhs, there are a lot of cows. There's nowhere for them to live, but the cows are in the field, so they live in the cow shed. Then eventually the cows need their house back, so they get to build a dung shack in which they then spend the following winter.
But your grandmother sounded, you described as a very strong, formidable figure. She died.
Granny lived in Beaufort Gardens, and so I do remember in campaigning for, and this really dates me, in 1979, campaigning for a woman called Wendy Mantle in the Hendon South parliamentary election. And while I was campaigning in Cheney Walk and Renters Avenue and Beaufort Gardens around there, one of the canvassers came back and said, we've just knocked on the door of a woman who said she's not going to vote for our candidate because of her silly frizzy hairstyle. And I knew it was Granny. and so it was. She was like she was like a very strong person. I'm sure partly forged by the fact that she'd been this grand lady, playing bridge, and she had a chauffeur. There's an amazing picture in a book of her and my father in their huge car. They had a chauffeur and a gardener and all these. And I've been to the house they had. It was really, really nice. Obviously seasoned then by this experience in Siberia. But she builds this house out of cow dung. They have no food, they have no fuel. It's below freezing inside. She has to go every day and collect water from the river, which is the
Why did she go and not the men?
There were no men. In this little hut, there were 2 women, the Pergo sisters, a countess, old lady, a younger woman who almost immediately dies of diarrhea, I think, really, my father. So she's the only person that can do it. They have to have some water. So she goes she fights her way out of the shack and goes and gets water every day, and then comes back and teaches my father Schiller, and she doesn't want him to atrophy. She teaches him languages and really quite an extraordinary thing to do in the circumstances, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Amazing.
And you say that the only sort of difference between the Nazis and Soviets were that your grandmother could correspond.
That was the difference between actually my grandfather and my grandmother, because my grandfather was a prisoner. He was a criminal, in fact. And in fact, one of the things that made his experience so particularly bad is that the political criminals, who were dangerous fascists, and sorry to use that phrase, yids, which is the phrase that the Soviets used, were much worse than actual criminals. So the actual criminals, the thieves, the murderers, the rapists, were in charge of the political prisoners. That was a horrendous experience. But he couldn't get correspondence, so nothing's heard from him. My grandmother, the one thing that being deported meant is theoretically you were a free citizen. It's just that you were free to live on a state collective farm in Kazakhstan, which wouldn't have been my grandmother's optimal residence. They received this food. Now, I know that because I found 90 pieces of correspondence from Lvov that went to the farm. My grandmother kept them all, and some of them list the food parcels that had gone. Some of them bemoan the fact that food parcels clearly hadn't arisen. It was very, very expensive because the people who lived in Lvov no longer had any money. All my grandfathers, everything had been confiscated. My great uncle was working as a rat catcher. He'd been an attorney. They had no savings. It was very difficult, but they still got the money to send this food. But some of it did arrive, and the bit that did arrive did save them. Without it, my grandmother's pretty sure they would have died.
And then fortuitously for them, maybe for all of us really, the Germans broke the pact, invaded the Soviet Union, and suddenly the worm turned.
It's good for my grandmother and my grandfather and my great uncle on that side of the family. But my grandmother is one of 7 siblings, and she is the only one that survives the war. And the reason for that is that it was very bad for the Jews that lived in Lvov. Now, anyone who's read Philippe Sands' amazing East-West Street, what happens for Philippe when he researches that is he never really finds out what happens to his relatives who lived in Lvov, and I didn't either. Right? So this book is characterised by an almost insane amount of detail that I was able to find, and I get to the point where I could, in any month of the war, I could really tell you in great detail where my relatives were, what they were doing, what their experiences were, even what they were eating and everything like that. But then there is a silence that covers all the people who lived in Lvov, or Lviv as it had become, when the Nazis arrive and they kill everyone. I end up with one relative manages somehow to escape and end up in Argentina, my grandmother's sister-in-law. But apart from that, everybody dies.
So your grandfather joins the Polish army?
My grandfather is able to join. So what extraordinarily, basically, one of the things that happens in this book is that Stalin captures all the Polish officers at the same time as he is deporting all the Poles, or just before it actually. And he takes them, and then he decides they're all guilty of a crime, and without telling them at all that he's done this, he takes 20,000 of these people, 15,000 of which were officers and 5,000 other people, and shoots them all. And then Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and he realizes, as Beria said, we've made a big mistake, which is one way of putting it, isn't it? But I mean, they were all involved in it. They all signed the document, so it wasn't some junior person who did this. Stalin ordered this to happen, together with Beria and Molotov, and their signatures are on the document that orders this to be done. Even though that only was revealed many, many years later. It's known as the Katyn massacre because that's where some of the graves of some of the people was found in Katyn, but actually it took place in 3 or 4 places. But what it means is that Stalin agrees with the Allies. He's going to set up an army of Poles, but he secretly knows he's actually killed all of their officers. So it's quite embarrassing for him, and he covers up for it with a sort of gigantic lie. But fortunately, there are a small handful of generals of officers he hasn't killed, one of whom is an actual general, which was a man called Władysław Anders. He's got Anders in Lubyanka. So Beria drops into Anders' cell all of a sudden and says, we're about to release you and you're going to become the head of an army. He doesn't, he's released, they sent to the car, he's basically got, all this sort of a chauffeur-driven car and an officer accompanying him, but no shoes or socks. And then he's given his briefcase back, which turns out to be someone else's case with someone else's swimming trunks in them. The whole thing was bizarre, but Anders turns out to be an extraordinary individual. And that was very, very fortunate for everybody, particularly for my dad and his mum and my grandfather, because Anders creates an army and Dolu, my grandfather, is able to join, and somehow or other, because what happens, everybody who's spread out in all these deported families are spread out. They're told they can go, but they're not given any money or any food or any way of getting there. But because Dolu joins up with this army somehow, he is able to send an officer to collect them, and they are miraculously, and I've used the word miracle in the title of my book, miraculously they are reunited in the Soviet Union. But the great achievement of Anders was then to get them out of the Soviet Union. The British didn't want them. There's actually a Foreign Office document. Somebody sent this to me. I would never have found it. It's absolutely amazing. So it's a whole document about the fact that there are these Poles that want to come to join the British Army from the Soviet Army. And a Foreign Office person in the mission in Cairo, which was a proper government ministry, has written on it by hand. He's written, the problem with this is that these people, if Stalin keeps them, he wouldn't be embarrassed to starve them to death. But if we get them, we'll have to feed them, because we so maybe it would be better to delay somewhat. I mean, it was extraordinary to say. And underneath it, somebody's going, I do wish you hadn't written this down. It'll look very odd to future historians. That's honestly, I've got they're all, that's almost the exact words. It's really amazing. He manages to convince the British to take the Poles, and he manages to persuade Stalin to let them go. I think Stalin wants to let them go because Anders keeps asking him about the officers, and Stalin's lied to him too many times. He picks the phone up and pretends to speak to somebody and says, yeah, they're sort of on their way. I mean, it's like, so it's a bit sort of it's almost embarrassing, and he's caught in it. So he thinks to get rid of them, he won't have any questions.
So they survive the war. They go to, they're sent from Iran to Palestine, and then make their way to London in 1947. Your mother at the end of the war was in New York for 2 years, and also goes to London in 1947. And
they meet in Hugo Grin's synagogue. While Dolu, my grandfather, does survive the war, the Gulag killed Dolu. Right, and indeed, it's even the doctor that looks after him during his dying days says so explicitly in the letter he wrote to my grandmother. He is, when he arrives in the Gulag, he's a 50-year-old man, and he's pulling logs to the river like a pack horse. And the way that the Nazis, it's a Freudian slip, the Soviets organised it was you would get food in relation to how much work you did, but the food was always a little bit less than the work. So everybody got pulled down inexorably to die. And the death rate in the Gulag was 25% a year. When I read that at first, I thought, have I got that? And you write these numbers down. I'd written all these notes, and I went back to the source material to check my note was correct, because that's too many, surely that can't be right, but it was right. That people starved to death. So he did survive. Mainly he survived because the people that he was working with, so many people he was working with, there were all these criminals, and the guards were illiterate, the criminals were illiterate. Even the literate people were innumerate, and Dolu could speak Russian, he was very literate, and he could count. So they ended up making him bookkeeper. And when you were bookkeeper, the most important thing was you had a desk, not to work on, but to sleep on, because otherwise you would quite often be sleeping literally in a ditch in the snow. Or if you slept in a hut, the Urkai, in other words, the criminals, gangs, would just steal everything and then might kill you. So this desk was a lifesaver.
So you said your grandparents moved to London. You describe your grandfather a bit sort of almost like a broken man compared to what he was, understandably.
Dolu, yes.
Dolu, yeah. And,
not Alfred.
No, Dolu. And I look at your grandmother was strong and redoubtable. Was she ever bitter that before the war she was living in a big house with a husband and driving cars, and suddenly she's living in, nothing wrong with Hendon Central?
No, I don't know. So certainly when I did this work, I understood why my grandmother would set off looking like wearing this cloth coat. I've got a picture of it in the book, and her beautiful hat, white gloves, and she was going to the Express Dairy on the corner with Hendon Central Station. She certainly never got over Dolly dying. That's true. Bitterness has never been a family trait. So I don't know. She died when I was 18, so I knew her properly, but not as an adult. So I don't know that. My father wasn't, and I think they saw no purpose in it, really, and certainly wouldn't want to pass that on to us. So I don't know, but I don't think so. And I don't think she felt. They never went back. My dad didn't go back to Lvov even after the Berlin Wall fell, and I think they felt it was, as long as they were safe and they had the children. So I think that they were, I think my grandmother was quite happy by the time she died.
Was your father ever put out, if I can put it that way, that not vis-a-vis competition, and I love the phrase from your mother, wasn't a competition, but the fact that not only his own or his family's, but what the Jews that were sent off to Siberia, that their tribulations are relatively, even today, unknown in history.
So, look, I think there are a number of things. Mum, at first, nobody was interested in the stories at all. If anyone talks to my mother about where she came from, it was like, did you wear clogs or live in a windmill when you were in Bashkal? And they didn't know anything about the concentration camps. And then gradually, when I was about ages 16 to 20, it began to become more talked about. I remember Mum going to Hendon Reform, to Danescroft, giving a talk, and she said to me, do you think they'll be interested in the fact that I saw Anne Frank in Belsen? I said, yeah, I think they would be, actually. So she was always afraid to bore people with the story. So people did then begin to ask. And so she then ended up talking in schools, and George Osborne asked her to come and talk to his children because he wanted them to meet her. So she went to Downing Street, she met David. On another occasion, she met David and Samantha Cameron. So she talked, and she did a BBC radio programme because the people who'd taken her in after the war, they'd also taken in Hilda Speer, Albert Speer's daughter, on another occasion. So they had a documentary, which was my mother meeting Hilda Speer. So she'd always think, and nobody ever asked my dad anything. In fact, when my father's grandson, my nephew Simon, he starred in a TV programme where people went back to their roots, and he went to Lvov, and they did this programme. But the whole programme was about the Nazis, and they never mentioned the Soviets once. And so the whole story, in fact, was a story that had taken place entirely after my grandparents were not there anymore. So the story is totally unknown. And my father occasionally raised that, and it did impact his politics. And it's impacted mine, which is that it's very standard for a person, particularly by my religion, but also of my sort of haven't got university liberalism, to be anti-Nazi. But I'm quite unusual in how anti-communist I am.
Okay, so that's so your parents lived in Hendon Central in Cheney Walk for most of their lives. You described them as very contented with each other, with their
pretty much
social
all their
circle.
life. They pretty much came here. They lived in Golders Green with my grandfather's first cousin was Sir Jules Thorne of Thorne EMI. So when they came here, they lived with Anna Thorne for a year in Finchley, and then they moved to Hendon. They were on the Hendon Way, where Brent Cross Shopping Centre is. Then they moved to Beaufort Gardens, and then they moved to Cheney Walk. And my mother died in bed in Cheney Walk in 2017.
And your mum had a remarkably close relationship with her mother-in-law, which is sort of quite unusual and exceptional, because your father went every day to see his mother, and she was there every Friday night.
It was very intense, that relationship between Granny and my dad, because of what they'd been through. There's some correspondence I've included in the book in which my father explains they sort of have a kind of, they don't even need to speak to each other, they've got this own language. And of course they can speak to each other in Polish, which my mother can't understand. And yet they manage to have a really exceptionally close relationship. I think that was caused a little bit by the fact that my mother was, both my parents were very nice people, and I always say the only annoying thing they ever did was die, really. I can't really remember anything else. And
not that you say you're starving, you always say.
Yeah, they told me off for that, but my mum was determined that relationship would work, and it did. They were very close to each other indeed.
Okay, I think I'll finish it. Let me do, I will open the floor to the audience. I'm not going to hog you all night, much as I'd like to, but a few quick fire questions.
Oh dear.
It's all right. Okay. I think you can cope with me. Have your views on Israel changed post October the 7th? And originally you had always written that you were, in favour of the state of Israel, pro-Israel, but you were also in favour of a Palestinian state. Does that remain your view, or?
Well, I think yes, it does. I tell you, it's changed in one very important way, which is I'm much less convinced we're going to get anywhere by argument. And I'm much more hard line about that fact. I just had the experience, I wrote 2 articles in the Times, quite deliberately, in which I stated the part of the Palestinian case that I was listening to and was willing to yield to discuss, one of which included the need for a Palestinian state. But it even included the fact that there was a resurgent Palestinian nationalism, and I accept Benny Morris's account of 1948 and what happened. I don't think Golda Meir's account of it was a full account, so I accept that. And I put that in an article. I have not received one, and by this I don't mean, that's not an exaggeration, I mean I have not received one letter, comment, tweet, any personal communication of any kind by a single person who supports the Palestinian cause that reciprocates to that article, to either of those articles, the first of which made the concessions, the second of which pointed out that I hadn't received it, and thus fished for people to actually respond, not one. And that really is a lesson, right? Which is, unfortunately, we're in a war to prevent another set of people killing all the Jews. Half the Jews in the world live in Israel. What we cannot achieve by argument, we will have to be very tough about. So it hasn't changed the structure of my view, but it has changed that, and that's quite fundamental actually. Quite unusual to me, not usually my stance on anything, but it doesn't seem to be amenable to an argument. And so I just note the one time that people seem to make peace is when they lose militarily, and so unfortunately, reluctant though we are to pursue the end of an argument in that way, we're going to have to do that.
You describe in the various publicity that your father said to you when you were growing up, if you want to be a legislator, you've got to keep the rules. I think your dad took one to the nth degree, and you were not allowed to mix tapes because the British.
He didn't forbid me. I interpreted. I took it to that degree. So I do take this view, and I do take it now. I'm not. My mum was always keen. You should show a sense of proportion, but I do have the view in this country we've got a pretty wide ability to influence the rules of the country, and I do actually think it's a genuine ability. Right? I do think if there's pretty much nothing, big or small, the public can't change if it wants to, and does, and it's one of the reasons why, despite being a very strong Remainer in the European referendum, I was passionately opposed to failing to implement the outcome. You had to show that this country would do that. Even big things that you thought were ruinous. And in those circumstances, I don't think there's much excuse for deciding you're not willing to abide by the law. There are a few things that you should avoid, where I think you're entitled to doing it. So the suffragettes was an example, although where they didn't have a right, to vote, so they couldn't change the law. So I think they were entitled to break it, though I would note it was incredibly ineffective. It probably delayed women having the vote by about 10 years, what they did, because it pushed the liberal mainstream against them when they might actually move towards them. So I take a very strong pro-rule of law view, but I also apply that to the right as well as to, stop the war, or just stop oil.
Talk of honesty in politics, it looks like this year we could have President Trump back in office.
Yeah.
Does that concern you?
Yeah, I think it's.
The man that's not
I think
renowned for his honesty, and the more dishonest, the more he's accused, the more popular
it's
again.
calamitous outcome. I think he's much better organised than he was last time, and I think he has gained the view that there's something to be said for dictatorship. And if he's re-elected, he'll have reached the view that no one can stop him, and he'll be right. No one had been able to stop him. The idea that such a person might be elected President of the United States and would then, in my view, pull out from Ukraine, for example, I think is really, really upsetting thought. And there are people in the Jewish community who think, well, he did put the capital in Jerusalem and he's on our side. Trump is on nobody's side except for his own. He is totally unreliable as an ally. If anybody puts their faith in him, just look at the people he employed. He sacked them in 2 weeks. He would be as quick as possible the enemy of the Jewish people, whom he regards in any case. If you ever listen to him, his view of why he likes the Jews is a crass caricature of Jewish characteristics. I think he is properly dangerous to us, and it upsets me when people think he's pro-Israel. He's really, really not that. I understand it, because we're all concerned about the growth on the progressive left of anti-Zionism in the United States. And you could look at the Democrats as having kind of ignited a race war in the United States that they're now losing. So I'm very critical of the stance they've taken, but Trump's election would be a total disaster. And for all that, we just better hope that Joe Biden doesn't fall down by the stairs.
Transporting immigrants to Rwanda.
Yeah, so I don't think, so there are a number of points on this. The first is, I think it's legitimate for a country to control the number of immigrants that it has. And when we talk about, Britain and the kinder transport, we had hundreds of thousands of people come to this country last year. So the idea that we're now much less generous than we used to, that we were in the good old days, that isn't true at all. We're much more generous. But no country can, be in a situation where it cannot control at all the number of people, dimensions of hundreds of thousands. That seems to me to be a lot. There is a specifically Jewish problem, which is an awful lot of the people coming into the country don't like Jews, and that community is growing in size, and we can tell what it is. So we have some interest in the control of migration, but we are also, because many of us are from refugee families, very sympathetic to the refugee story, and we believe that refugee problems should be dealt with properly. I don't think people should be able to come here in boats, and I don't want to encourage slave gangs. I think the effort to stop the boats is a correct public policy, though not politically a very intelligent strategy. It's a correct public policy to have. But I don't think the Rwanda policy will work. I've got three big problems with it. First of all, I think it'll turn out to be an insufficient deterrent. It will be a deterrent, but it'll be an insufficient deterrent. And weirdly, if Rwanda's an acceptable place to go to, then why would it be a deterrent? People will just come here hoping that maybe they'll end up in Rwanda. But so it's a deterrent. I think secondly, I don't really approve of while I approve of a scheme in which we process applications offshore, I don't approve of a scheme in which we simply export our asylum seekers. And the third thing is, I've got some questions about Rwanda as a place to do it. Rwanda is a place from which we get asylum seekers. And so there's always been there's an argument on the sort of centre of the Conservative Party about Rwanda, and about whether Kagame is a liberator or whether he's turned rogue. probably at the sceptical end of that about Kagame.
Okay, I've got two more, and then I will open it, I promise. Keir Starmer,
Yeah.
member of the Corbyn shadow cabinet, and he wasn't overly vocal at that point. Does that concern you?
Yeah. It's very difficult to work out who Keir Starmer is. There are at least two people who don't know who he is. I'm one of them and he's the other. Keir Starmer, you know, if you read a history of Keir Starmer's policy, he's always positioned himself just to the left of whoever the leader is. Until Corbyn, you know, where he was alongside him, but then, you know, you couldn't be to the left of Corbyn. There wasn't such a position. So he is, but there is some suggestion that he's moving somewhat towards the centre, and I think it's true. I think it's a genuine thing. I would say about him, I think he's a person of integrity. I think he's genuine about his views about his desire to stamp out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and has been pretty effective and quite brave in doing it. I think I don't, you know, my big concern during the Corbyn years was that my lovely friends who support the Labour Party found themselves in a position whereby they couldn't be members of it and couldn't advocate for it, and I thought that was tragic, and I don't think that pertains now. And you know, Luciana's rejoined the Labour Party. I'm really pleased for her. I think it's great. You know, I have other disagreements with the Labour Party, which means that's not my party, but it's a big mainstream democratic party, and it's important that it not be a danger. And I don't think it is a danger, but I do think Keir Starmer is a person who is quite confused about who he is, and though that's not a great thing because it can lead you to be pushed around and make big errors, but it's not unique in politics.
Okay. My last question to you. You've been interviewed hundreds of times, and you're very patient. What's been the most difficult or interesting question you've faced? And what was your answer?
What's the last one you asked, Professor?
You're very kind.
Not really. You know, the really embarrassing thing is there's so many questions, and you then forget. I'm going to fluff this really. I think it's been amazing talking about the book, and the lovely thing about it is because you get, you know, to talk about your parents and your relatives, and I've discovered some relatives while writing this book. I didn't really sort of know. I kind of knew I had them a little bit, but I found out who they were, what they did, what they were like. That was an amazing experience. And so when I've been asked about them, to talk about them, that has been a kind of really nice experience. And the other thing that's been nice, I took a decision to go to to speak in lots of synagogues, because lots of synagogues had invited me. I couldn't do them all, and so I thought yes for the book. And this was two things. One, I discovered immediately why I'd said no before. I got myself overwhelmed with events. But it has been lovely at this time when the Jewish community is under such a lot of pressure to share it with so many of my co-religionists and so many friends, and that has been a reassuring and lovely experience.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Any questions?
I'll ask one. Hi. You've said your views on what would happen if something happened to Joe Biden, in terms of how it would be a disaster. What would be your view about the Labour Party if something would happen to Keir Starmer? In other words, not Labour as it is, but Labour as it could be underneath the leader.
Yeah. So I think, what I think is that at the moment, if something, you know, if what happened to Hugh Gateskill happened to Keir Starmer, we were a year out from the election and something terrible happened to him. And let's first of all say, at a human level, he's such a nice person. I think that would be awful, obviously. But I think they would let someone in his mould. They can see that they're on the edge of success. They're on the edge of government. And the political settlement they've reached is quite robust. That's what I would argue. They've got quite strong control of the party now, and there isn't an obvious alternative on the left of the party. What I think might happen when they get into power is that all the things that, you know, so if you ask yourself, why can't Rishi Sunak stop the boats, cut taxes, fix the NHS, it's not because he's an idiot, or even because though this is certainly true, there are a lot of Conservative MPs who are idiots. It's because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to solve these problems. They're going to find that out, and then it's going to be very hard. You know, in power for a government, it would have been hard, for example, for him handling this ceasefire issue. He's done quite well, but he's in opposition. Even then, he had numbers of resignations. So I think in office, when they are under pressure, then they'll definitely be in, you know, then there'll be, what you say will be in play at that point. But who the leader of that nascent group will be, I just don't know.
Just still on the sort of national politics theme, and we all expect an election in the coming months. What do you see as the 3 or 4 main issues that you, after election, will face whoever is Prime Minister?
Look, the biggest issue is going to be budgetary, right? So if you're a Labour leader, the issue that will face them immediately is how to increase public. So let's assume they win a majority first, right? Because otherwise the minority parties will force issues onto the agenda that they wouldn't otherwise deal with. So I, for example, think they'll park difficult constitutional issues like the House of Lords. They won't engage in electoral reform, but if the Liberal Democrats help them in advice, they might. I think Keir Starmer's instinct, I mean, he said as much to me, will be to ignore that because they put themselves in a stupid position where they have to support him anyway. So he'll probably, let's assume that he's got a majority or governs as if he has one. I think economy will be a big issue for him. If Trump is elected, there is a massive issue for this country in how we make good our defence position. We are entirely tied to an Atlantic alliance on the basis that we share a similar world outlook to the United States, and we won't. This is difficult for a Conservative government, but it's very difficult for a Labour one because, you know, lots of people don't believe from a completely different angle in the whole theory of deterrence and defence. You know, as much as anti-Zionism, not believing that you should ever engage in wars is part of what is moving the left on the issue of Gaza. So I think the whole issue of foreign policy and defence will be a big one. And then he's going to put one on the agenda, which we're all going to engage in by the end of this year, and that is assisted dying. He's going to give, and I wrote about this, he's promised parliamentary time. When he delivers parliamentary time, it'll probably take a year, 2 years before it happens, but that's very serious. The Lords is overwhelmingly in favour of it. I think with a Labour majority in the House of Commons, the Commons will be in favour of it. If he allows parliamentary time, that's the missing piece of the puzzle. We'll have an assisted dying law within 2 to 3 years. That'd be huge.
Benji.
Grant Shapps had a tweet today about the fact that the UK is in a pre-war moment. What I want to know is whose defence is worse, the United Kingdom's or Chelsea's?
The United Kingdom's. I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to answer that question or whether it's just a quip. Let me address both. Okay, I'll address both. So let me address the United Kingdom first. The United Kingdom's defence position I'm very worried about because we are so reliant on the United States. If we can know, at some point, the United States will elect another unreliable government, even if it doesn't do so this time. We cannot rely on the Pax Americana, which has sustained us, and their view of the world, and that means that over the next 10 years we have to address defence spending, despite the fact that that is very, very painful for us to do. So I'm very concerned about it. Chelsea I'm less concerned about, and the reason is simple. So the background of this, as you said, is I'm a director of Chelsea. For those of you who don't know much about football, we've engaged in an unorthodox strategy. Because of the way that football is regulated, you have to relate your expenditure to your income. And Chelsea has relied for a long time on having a very rich owner, but its revenue base isn't as large as some of the other big clubs. So we have to make some canny decisions if we want to remain competitive right at the top. You can purchase middle players, but if you want to purchase right at the top, you have to purchase them at a wage rate you can afford. So we have set about buying a lot of extremely young players, as a result of which we've got historically and sometimes record-breakingly young teams that we're fielding, and the results have been pretty inconsistent. They haven't been catastrophic, but for Chelsea, they haven't reached the standard we've reached in the past. And some fans are anxious about that. I completely get that. But I still think the strategy, risky though it is, was a correct one. If there's an answer to your question.
I'll take one last one, Gab. Last two.
Whilst on the subject of defence, God forbid we should ever have to use Trident, would Starmer be the person who could engage it and use it?
Let's hope we never get into that position. You know, each Prime Minister has to send a letter, has to write a letter, which are the instructions to the nuclear commander as to what to do if they are out of communication. And nobody you get, I think as Prime Minister you do get to see other people's letters, I'm not sure about that, but nobody knows what the Prime Minister's put in the letter. And when even in all the work I did with David Cameron, he never hinted to me what he did. I would wonder whether lots of Prime Ministers what they would actually say in that letter. But I know that he would answer the question, would you use that nuclear deterrent? Yes. Because if you don't answer it yes, you may as well not have it. But whether he would use it, who would know whether any of us would, and what our circumstances would be. That's as much about who you are as a person than about your politics.
Malcolm started us off and he'll finish us off.
You clearly advocate strongly for the two-state solution. How would you counter Tipi Hotoveli's comments that there are no innocent Palestinians?
Look, I think it's a very dangerous thing to start to sweepingly. So there are a couple of points. The first is I support a two-state solution because I think it's the only possible end point, unless we think Palestinian nationalist aspirations are going to go away, or unless we're willing to countenance an Israel that ends up actually being an apartheid state, something that we virulently and correctly resist the idea that it is. So if you don't want to end up in that situation, ultimately you have to move to a partition as was proposed by the UN. The reason why people like me keep on losing against the sort of political position against people like Zippy is because it looks incredibly naive to suggest to anybody that we'd create a state with these people next door. So ultimately it can only happen when they've moved their position. I don't think a two-state solution is around the corner, but I think Israel shouldn't put itself in a position whereby it can't have one, because that's the route to peace. I think that lots of people in the Palestinian community are to blame for the political position they've taken, which is incredibly damaging to them and incredibly damaging to Jews everywhere, and has created a war which they keep starting wars and complaining about losing them. And in fact, this one, they started to complain about losing it even before they actually started losing it. In other words, they were protesting against the war they'd begun. It was amazing. But I think it's not good language to say there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. How comfortable can any of us be saying those kind of things? And particularly when, tragically, the children of the people who launched this war upon us are dying, and that's not a good moment to say that, even if any moment was a good moment to say it. So I think it would have been better not said. But that doesn't mean I'm not pretty resolute about what Israel's doing. My challenge constantly is tell me what else we should do. Tell me what else they should do, we should do. If anybody has come up with a solution, then they can put it on a postcard. I haven't, the solution if the solution doesn't involve preventing Hamas from ruling Gaza or anywhere else, it's not a solution, because it doesn't face up to who those people are. And I always remember, this is like standing with my friend Marianne Seagart as journalist sometimes, and she was hugely upset when Pope Benedict appeared out of the balcony when the Pope was being chosen, and it turned out to be this kind of quite right-wing Catholic. And I said, what did you expect, MA, that it would be Stephen Byers they picked, right? You know, these unfortunately, the Palestinians are, the whole of that is just like a very, very, we can't expect them to yield to us. We're going to ultimately have to win that battle. That is very tough, but we shouldn't make our already tough job any tougher by using unnecessary rhetoric that makes it more difficult to win the battle, political battle in this country. And much as I do actually personally like Zippy, and everybody in Israel at the moment gets my solidarity even when I'm politically different from them, but I think that was really not very helpful.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Brian Bramblett will bring the formal proceedings to a close. Just to say, for anybody who hasn't bought Lord Finkelstein's book, it is available at the back. I will, or Joel, bring them forward, and Daniel will sign a few copies.
We have a limited number of
limited
copies.
number, for reasons I won't go into, but they are available at the back. Brian.
Hi. Daniel, thank you very much for this evening, for sharing your family story with us. And there's a personal thanks that I owe you too. As soon as your book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, was published, here at Now, we decided that we wanted to invite you to speak. In fact, there were numerous occasions in the past when we wanted to get you here. You are a British institution, a communicator, one who has profound impact on our Jewish lives in the UK. This stems from your humorous and compassionate writings across a great variety of topics, but special respect is due for your musings on daily life, the diary of a Jewish family living round the corner from us in Leafy Pillar. You fully, publicly, and without inhibition, embrace our Jewish heritage and identity. This helps foster the overall feeling that this is a decent place for Jews to live, even in these very difficult times. But as your book demonstrates, we cannot be complacent. We must contend with the danger signs as canaries for autocracy, popularism, intersectionality, and with the echo chambers of conspiracy theories. But there is another issue. There is a gap created by the loss of those who directly experienced the Shoah, its devastation, the rebuilding, the need to remember. Your superb book is a major resource to help us bridge this gap. Your real life story ends on a positive note. Your family has survived. Love has conquered hate. An example of the ongoing wonder of Jewish survival. And my personal thanks to you, Daniel. They are for your father. I was unsure, once upon a time, what to study at university. My father was a professor of mathematics, and he suggested that I speak to one of his colleagues. So I wrote to your father, Professor Ludwig Finkelstein, who was a very kind and patient man. And talking to me for some time in his office and putting me at my ease, he firmly dissuaded me from his subject, engineering, and suggested that I study physics. I was very grateful for his advice, which I took, and it turned out to be very sound. So thank you. Only later did I learn that this was the path that he had taken too. A final word before we close, which we've touched on this evening, is that we pray for a positive end to the present war. And on behalf of us all at NER, thank you, Lord Daniel Finkelstein.
Okay, so how are we going to do this?